Okay, we're back again for another episode of This Week in Christian History. And this week that we are focused here in August is we're focusing on August the 9th, 1788, which is the day that one of the premier missionaries throughout the world was born on this day, Adoniram Judson. And there's probably 800 different ways to say his name, okay? Because it's not Tom, right? Or it's not Brent even. So that makes it that a little bit easier. We're glad to have Dr. Brent Aucoin be with us here, who is a professor of history at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in North Carolina, and he also is an associate dean for Judson College, nonetheless, which is headquartered there on campus. So, Dr. Quinn, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, tell us about, some background on Judson, and he obviously had some impact if he gets a college named after him, and he's at a college, right? I think in Alabama at one point in time, and a town in Arkansas named for him. So, I wouldn't say he's B team. He certainly is A team. Give us some background on him and kind of why we might be talking about him today.
Well, big picture, I guess the main reason we're talking about him would be that he's considered to be one of the first missionaries to ever be sent out from the United States of America to the foreign mission field. After William Carey and British Baptists had sent out missionaries and others behind them in England from various denominations, America had yet to send out any missionaries. And Judson was a part of the very first group of those men and women sent out specifically as missionaries by missionary organization. And so that makes him historically significant. But beyond that, the work that he did ultimately in Burma, modern day Myanmar, was one that, though certainly not flawless and perfect, in many ways is a model and an inspiration even to missionaries today and wannabe missionaries. And so reading his story, really the story of the Judsons, he and his wife and wives, so end up losing two wives and marrying three times before his life is over. But each of those wives was very much a partner, participant in the missionary endeavor. And so reading and knowing their stories gives us a glimpse into how not only how missions were done in their infancy, if you will, in the modern Christian movement, but even how can they best be done even today? Like, what can we learn from them? Because although it's a common story, although there weren't immediate great results once they landed on the field, with hard work and perseverance and presumably the pleasant blessing of the Holy Spirit, there was a harvest eventually.
Well, so how did he come to be a missionary? Do you think this, I mean, what's his backstory, as we might say, for him to be able to go from whatever epiphany he may have had from the time that he got on the boat?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating story, and it's one where we can go into a great deal of detail, but let me try to give you somewhat of an abbreviated version of it. So he was raised in a Christian family. In fact, his father was the pastor of one of the pilgrim churches there in Plymouth. So it was actually the third congregational church of Plymouth, but one of those churches that you can tie back to the original pilgrims. And so his father was pretty respected preacher and pastor in his own right, but his son Adoniram was very bright and intelligent, and both of his parents recognized that early on, as did others, and great things were expected of Adoniram, and eventually great things were accomplished by and through Adoniram. But let's see, so raised in a strong Christian home, his father urges him to go actually to Rhode Island College, what is today Brown, which was a Baptist school, because the main congregational school there for most of those who were in the Plymouth area typically go to Yale. The father believed that Yale had sort of gone astray theologically. And even though they were not Baptistic, he preferred to send his son to the Rhode Island College, which was fairly new, as opposed to Yale. And Judson indeed goes to Rhode Island College. In fact, when he arrives, he's only 16 years old. He had just turned 16.
Wow.
He had graduating as the valedictorian. So very smart, gifted. However, while he was there, he befriended a man who was named Jacob Eames, very open about his lack of belief in God and at times his ridiculing of Christians. And so by the time Judson graduated, he was no longer claiming to be a Christian. So the story of how he ends up, being this sort of great Christian figure kind of starts from there. How do you go from leaving college basically as an unbeliever? And it's an amazing story. It's a wonderful story. And the kind of the shorter version of it is after graduating, eventually tells his parents he's not a believer, much to their grave disappointment. That he actually aspires to be a writer or even an actor, and he's just going to make his way to New York City to make a career in one or both of those areas. And in short, things do not go as planned for him there in New York City, and becomes somewhat despondent, not sure what to do. And sort of the famous part of the story is eventually just leaves New York City, not really sure where he's going to go. Kind of goes in the direction of one of his uncle's homes, and famously stops for the night at an inn, and learns that there's only one room left. But takes it, even though the innkeeper warns him the person next to you is very sick and moaning and groaning, and so you'll have those noises. But with no other alternative, Judson decides to stay, and has a hard time sleeping that night, but eventually does fall asleep, wakes up the next morning, and inquires with the innkeeper about the person next door, and is informed the person had died.
Wow.
The innkeeper mentions that the person who had died just next door to Judson, who throughout much of the night heard his anguish, was his best friend from Rhode Island College, Jacob Eames. And Jacob had graduated a year earlier before Judson, and so they sort of lost touch. And God had already been sort of doing things with Judson in his period of unbelief, if you will. And even that very night, as he heard Jacob Eames in his anguish next door, God had put thoughts into Judson's mind he later would recollect, but particularly learning of his death. He sort of later wrote about that he reflected on Eames's death, that if the things that Eames had believed and helped to teach to Adoniram Judson about God not existing and sort of that mindset, he said, if that's true, then Eames's life meant nothing. It was just a mist and vapor that's gone, and that just can't be the case. And so ultimately, after that episode, Judson had gone towards his uncle's, goes back home. His father ministers to him, gets other sort of leading Congregationalists to sort of pour into Adoniram Judson, and Judson's faith comes alive, and they convince him to go to seminary, and so when he does that, when he goes to seminary, it's there that ultimately he is converted. Andover Seminary, it's in 1808, I believe it is, that he's ultimately converted there. Says that really I don't know if you want to use the word converted, but at least writes down that it's at that point he has committed his life to Christ and to serving God. So um, so goes to seminary and very quickly begins really just being exposed to writings dealing with other lands, other cultures, and particularly sort of just the lack of Christian witness and the gospel elsewhere. So it wasn't necessarily works promoting missions, although there were some of the things he read were explaining what William Carey and his fellow British Baptists were doing in Serampore. But he just read about other lands, including Burma. Came across a book there at Andover Theological Seminary dealing with Burma and just was fascinated to read about it. And so in the course of those readings in his first year at Andover, he became convinced that God was calling him to bring the gospel where it didn't really exist, and to go overseas specifically. Now, of course, his parents were thrilled that he had sort of gotten through that phase of
Right.
rejecting the faith, but they had high hopes and really well-grounded expectations that Judson would be even one of the most famous preachers in America, that he was just gifted to be able to, sort of come into that position one day.
Yeah. So he kind
And
of had
so,
an it factor, right? That is, if you want, maybe call it that, that his parents recognized, and to know that he was using, and I'm putting, assumptions out there, right? But that he was going to use those talents not on the stage somewhere and doing theater, but he's going to be able to use that connectivity to be able to connect to other people through the gospel and to be able to share that but doing it on a worldwide stage might have been a different thought process as they were going along too. So hey, we're enjoying our conversation that we're having here on the birth of Adoniram Judson, who was missionary extraordinaire, and enjoying our conversation with Dr. Brent Aucoin on that. So help me understand a little bit about, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of the story, but modern day or thought processes of what would be kind of missionary societies that sent people out. It's really kind of developing during this time period, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot of, three-ring binders. You're going to be able to go to a seminar and be able to tell you how to do it, right? So it's kind of, that's kind of got its own life, right?
that's right, it does. Yes. So it really begins in the 1790s with British Baptist organizing themselves to send out missionaries, with William Carey being in that first very small grouping of missionaries sent out. But that was such a change, or at least in Protestant Christianity of that day and time, that it just very quickly was embraced by others. In very short order there in England, other major Protestant denominations sort of followed suit and began creating their own societies or organizations specifically designed to raise money, to recruit individuals, to sort of prepare and train those individuals, and with the money raised to then send them out overseas into some land where the gospel was lacking, and that's what that association or society existed for. And so news of that British Baptist Missionary Society even reached America in very short order. And so from my research, what I've seen is very quickly you had missionary societies in America. I mean, at the local level, it's like a group of churches here in North Carolina say, let's create a mission society, and we're just going to raise money that we'll setting aside for the purpose of one day either us sending a missionary or send it to a different missionary organization. And so you had those sorts of organizations throughout throughout America as it existed then in the early 1800s and late 1790s. But you didn't have sort of a national mission sending agency until Adoniram Judson and some of his colleagues there at Andover Seminary um, convinced the Congregationalist denomination in America to formally create a mission sending organization called the ABCFM. So the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And so they create that in 1810, I think it is. And then Adoniram Judson will be part of the very first group sent out, he and his wife, Nancy. But they were very much inspired by what the British Baptists were doing, and with William Carey and Marshman and Ward and the others, that Serampore trio, as we call them. And in fact, when Congregationalists initially sort of, were not enthusiastic about the proposal brought to them by these seminary students to create a mission sending organization, they basically said, well, we'll go to the British Baptists and we'll petition that they send us out. Even though we're not Baptist, we're committed to going to the foreign mission field, and we need someone to aid us in that endeavor. We'll go to them if need be. And that helped to put some pressure on the Congregationalists to create the first American mission sending organization.
Now, what was Luther Rice part of that group?
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and that's Rice University, Luther Rice, right? Or is that not the same Rice? I don't know. Obviously, I don't know.
There is a Luther Rice, but I don't know about Rice University in Texas being named for him. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay, all right. Well, that's neither here nor there. All right, so he and his wife, and they go, but are they headed toward trying to connect specifically with William Carey and trying to get to India? Is that kind of their first launch out?
It is primarily because this is sort of a new venture for American Christians, specifically for this very new mission sending organization. They don't have personnel on the ground anywhere, and so let's get our feet wet by going where there's already a missionary effort that's organized, established, and at least then we'll go from there. So that's why that first group of missionaries is sent to India.
And so along that trail, if I understood that right, on that trip, he started to kind of have a theological, doctrinal change in his mindset, as whether kind of moving from the theology that he had and knowing that he was going to go hang out with a bunch of Baptists, he started to figure out, hey, I don't know, I may not agree with where I am now, but I think I might be seeing things in a different way by the time he gets there.
That's right. Yeah, so because they're going to India to first partner with, at least initially, with the Baptists who are there already. Judson decides he's going to investigate the issue of baptism. And he primarily focuses on the original languages. Judson was a gifted linguist, and we'll see the fruits of that once he gets on the foreign mission field. But interestingly, he purposefully investigates the matter without telling his wife, Nancy. And from his account of it, he goes into it sort of to just beef up the arguments that he thought he might have to make in support of infant baptism. But once he begins to question infant baptism and becomes more and more open to the idea of believers' baptism on this journey, it's a journey of 2 to 3 months, I can't remember, but it's a lengthy journey. Then so over time he begins to consider the believer's baptism position, and still doesn't tell his wife really until they arrive. And it's only after they arrive there in India that he mentions to her that he may be someone who now embraces believers' baptism. And she tells him that she too had been looking into it for
Huh.
the same reasons that he did. And that while she wasn't there yet where he was doctrinally, that she was open to that, like that her studies were moving her more and more in a direction of maybe questioning her assumptions about infant
Mm-hmm.
baptism and being more and more open to believers' baptism. And so only then, once they're in India, do the Judsons together, kind of as a couple, sit down and really discuss and read their Bibles and purposefully consider their position on the issue of baptism and ultimately come to embrace believers' baptism. And so once they do get to 7-4 and to the British Baptist, well, they're there while they're already there, and they get some aid from the British Baptist as they're debating the issue of baptism. But the point is, once they reach that position for themselves, they are baptized by William Ward, one of William Carey's compatriots. There's I might be able to find it. Let me bring up my notes if you have a moment, where
Okay.
Nancy talks about embracing believers' baptism. Here it is. If you don't mind me reading it.
Sure. No, go ahead. Yeah.
So this is what she wrote. She says, "Thus we are confirmed Baptists, not because we wanted to be, but because truth compelled us to be. We have endeavored to count the cost and be prepared for the many severe trials resulting from this change of sentiment. We anticipate the loss of reputation and of the affection and esteem of many of our American friends. But the most trying circumstance attending this change, and that which has caused us most pain, is the separation which must take between us and our dear missionary associates." So just to make the point, it was a monumental change, but it was one of the consequences that they were keenly aware of. And so it was one that brought them some significant pain. But in the end, they felt that that was their position that they had come to, and was now their conviction.
Well, but it had to kind of, I would assume, right? And again, I haven't done the study, and haven't read his journals, and I don't know about all those pieces and parts. But if I'm trying to think of it in maybe a real practical way, okay, what is it I'm going to quote unquote do when I get there? If I get to wherever there is, right? I mean, the step of actually having not only a conversion experience, but being able to, I mean, with people that you are sharing the gospel with, that is kind of a practical thing to say, okay, now the next thing we're going to need to do is you're going to need to be involved in believers' baptism. It kind of, it maybe is just the steps of understanding, okay, well, I got to get somewhere near a river or a creek or where, I mean, I mean, not maybe that specific, but just kind of understanding if I'm going to build this church and the church that we're going to be involved in, this is a big component of that. And so I got to think through that. And maybe that was the kind of some of the things that helped him think about, that made him move his doctoral position on that, or at least being able to absorb it about how to do it or how not to do it, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned Luther Rice earlier. So Luther Rice and another group sent out by the ABCFM arrived a little later. That first big group sent out by the ABCFM traveled to India on 2 different ships. And the one with Luther Rice on it arrived a little later. Rice was actually on a ship, at least for part of that journey. It took a number of stops on the way to India with a group of Baptists, where he apparently vociferously debated baptism with them. And I think once they got off the ship, although while they were there, he did not sort of come to their position. But once they left, as he meditated on it, he began to become more and more open to the position of believers' baptism. And like the Judsons, by the time he gets to India, he's pretty much there. Um, and then when he finds out the Judsons have embraced believers' baptism, he too does so and is also baptized, I believe, by William Ward. But Luther Rice was single.
Mm.
Um, and so it was decided now that those three individuals out of the original group had become Baptists. And the other Congregationalists that were sent with them had moved on to different mission fields. It
Okay.
became very clear once they got to India, they were not going to be able to stay. The East India Company, which sort of controlled that part of India at the time, was hostile to missionaries. They sort of tolerated the British Baptists who were there, but they were not going to allow these Americans to stay. And so they made it clear to them that they had to move on. And so they had moved on. Um, the Judsons had decided to move to Burma, and but they needed someone to go back and tell the ABCFM that they were no longer Congregationalists. And so that is why Luther Rice is sent back to America, where he does indeed inform the ABCFM. And of course, they cut off their funding to the Judsons. And then Luther Rice begins the process of alerting Baptist churches in America that they have two missionaries on the field on the other side of the world that they need to start supporting. And ultimately, what comes out of that is Baptist creating their own mission sending organization. In fact, they create what we call the Triennial Convention, which might be considered a predecessor to, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, Northern Baptist Convention. It's the first national organization of Baptists in America. And it was set up primarily to support the Judsons, but it quickly did other things such as domestic missions in America itself, in trying to provide theological education. They, for a short time, operate a college in Washington, D.C. But that Triennial Convention eventually sort of gets broken up into society. So it's a longer story, but ultimately what will come out of that will be the Southern Baptist Convention and then later the Northern Baptist Convention. So but then that all revolved around Luther Rice and his efforts to organize Baptists in America for the support of missionaries like the Judsons.
Wow. Well, the time probably will not allow us to go into the full detail of the rest of Judson's story, but give us kind of a little maybe a highlight of some of the high points about how they land in Burma,
Yeah,
he doesn't he convert, I mean, translate the Bible into the native language? I mean, that's a big deal.
he does, yes. And so their initial effort was in the way of preaching. That was going nowhere very quickly.
Mm.
Judson picked up the language, as did his wife Nancy, very quickly. Like I said, gifted linguist. And so preaching didn't seem to be bearing any fruit. They didn't stop doing that. But Judson turned his attention very quickly to trying to get tracts and then parts of the Bible, and then ultimately all of the scriptures into the Burmese language, which he helps basically to create. He provides somewhat of a real first dictionary for the Burmese language. And it was primarily through those tracts and those pamphlets that he was able to, with kind of a makeshift printing press, to distribute that they began to get converts. His first converts not until they've been there for 8 years.
Mm.
They suffered greatly initially. Conditions were really poor for them. But that first person who was a convert was apparently someone who had gotten a hold of one of the pamphlets and had read through it. And when he's speaking with Judson, Judson could hear some of the language from that pamphlet in the person's responses. So he knows, oh, this, that has had an impact. Um, and as for their time in Burma, it's really not until 1826. This is after Judson has spent 17 months in prison in Burma. Nancy has died by 1826. It's not until those sort of low points in their lives, and obviously the lowest possible point, earthly speaking, for Nancy Judson. It's not until then, really, that the conversions really began to grow in number. And so from 1826 until Judson's death in 1850, ultimately you're going to get thousands of conversions. But for those first, until 1826, so for more than a decade, there's not very much fruit. Maybe we can go into some of that in more detail, but
Sure,
it's sort of big picture of what happened to them on the field.
And we can kind of close out with this kind of thought. The model really that Judson creates of integrating yourself into the culture, learning their language, being able to get scripture into their language, understanding, hey, don't think you're going to be, Billy Sunday showing up one day and there's going to be a big tit crowd full of people that are going to come out. You're going to convert them like Billy Graham or something. And then, that's what it's going to be like the next day. Does that get kind of integrated back into these missionary societies to understand, hey, Mr. and Ms. Missionary, this is what you're getting into. Okay, you need to understand these are these things, and these are some things we learned not only from the Judsons, but the Careys and others and people like that as well. Is that a fair thing, or is that?
I think it is. Wouldn't say it was universally embraced or recognized, but I think that some who knew the story, knew Judson's approach, saw the wisdom in it and embraced it and put it into practice themselves. Judson very quickly sort of put himself into the culture, made himself a part of the culture in some ways. One of the ways in which he initially tried to witness to the Burmese was by setting up a zayat similar to what Buddhist priests did, where you just have just a structure on the streets where people can come and have conversations with you. And so he just sort of said, this is what the Buddhists do. I'm going to do almost kind of a Protestant Christian version of it. And that would attract large crowds. But no conversion from that. Like the Burmese would sort of respectfully listen to you. And so I think Judson recognized maybe two important components of his strategy was putting the gospel in the Burmese language and having them read it for themselves. But also he really focused on, he wanted converts, but he wanted converts to disciple, to then prepare them for witnessing to and winning the salvation of their countrymen. And that's what he really focused his attention on, making it so that he wasn't the primary spokesperson or preacher, but he's training native Burmese Christians to go out and be the gospel proclaimers and those who were being used by God to save souls.
Right. The train the trainers mode, right?
Yeah.
I mean, making disciples, really, you being disciples, I'm not going to be here forever, but you guys, are going to be able to do a heck of a lot better, more deeper job than I will. I'm not from here. You are. I mean, any number of things like that, right? To be able to. What a fascinating story, and what a great. I know there's way more to him and them and their full story about that, other than what we've been able to tap into today. But of course, we are using the anniversary or the date of his birthday. Well, August the 9th, 1788 is why we are focusing on that for this episode for this week in Christian history. Dr. Brent Aucoin, thank you so much for joining us and helping us learn more things about all things Christian history. We appreciate your time.
Well, I love the conversation. Thank you for having me.
All right, fantastic. Hey, and folks, also remember check our website out. to be able to learn about more resources that are there that hopefully help you learn more things about all things Christian history. It's what we're here for, the Center for Christian History.com. Appreciate it.